Now that you have some background in diseases both in the past and in the present, now I'm going to give you an introduction to insect vector diseases. First, we need to define what a disease is. It can depend on the textbook you're using, but for our introductory course, we're going to say it's a stress condition produced by the effects of a pathogen on a susceptible host. The pathogen is what actually causes the disease. This applies to insect vector diseases, and it also applies to bacteria and viruses and things like that causes us to be ill. And it really depends on the susceptibility of the host. For instance, you could have two different people exposed to the same pathogen, and in some cases you will have the full onset of a disease, and in other cases someone may not even realize they're infected. Some other key terms you should know related to diseases are pathology, which is the study of disease, and epidemiology, which is the study of the incidence, distribution, and determinants of a disease in a population. So let's talk about epidemiology a little bit more. Some other terms that are related to epidemiology that are important to know are endemic, which is referring to a disease that's native to a region or population, and epidemic, which refers to a disease outbreak affecting a high proportion of a population. So in some regions of the world, we might say that malaria is both endemic and epidemic. In order for a disease to be prevalent in an environment, three things must be present: a pathogen, a vector, which can be either an insect or some other type of arthropod vector that spreads an insect vector disease, and the host, which could be an animal or a human. Now, to give a little example about a good vector, let's talk about a tick versus a mosquito. Now, both of these are good vectors. They both spread disease, but is one of them a little bit better than the other as far as passing along diseases? Well, first of all, let's look at a couple characteristics of a good vector: blood feeding and a degree of association with humans. Now, these both have those characteristics. However, a tick is not mobile, not as mobile as a mosquito. They can't move as far because they basically have to wait on plant material for a host to pass them by. Then they're able to latch on and begin feeding. A mosquito, on the other hand, does not have to be in a certain location and wait for its host. It's able to fly and find a host. Therefore, this mosquito has more opportunities to come in contact with a pathogen and continue to spread the pathogen to other hosts that it bites, where the tick is usually in one spot, and it might get a little bit of mobility just from a person moving around, but in general it's not going to be as mobile as a mosquito. Therefore, the mosquito is going to be a slightly better vector of diseases than the tick is going to be. So how do insects actually transmit pathogens? Well, there's mechanical transmission and biological transmission. Now, with mechanical transmission, this is a passive transfer, and this is the type of thing you're going to see with flies and cockroaches, for example. These are the types of insects that crawl in trash or other types of substrates, and they pick up pathogens on their bodies, and then they walk around on your counters or your food and allow you to be exposed to those pathogens. Now, biological transmission is more what we see with the blood-sucking vectors, such as the mosquitoes. So in this case, the pathogen actually increases or develops within the vector. So part of its life cycle needs to be completed within the vector. And then usually what needs to happen is that vector then will pass along that pathogen to a host, and that pathogen can complete another section of its life cycle within the host. Now that you have an overview of what pathology and epidemiology are, what endemic and epidemic mean, and you also understand the agents needed for disease, the pathogen, vector, and host, now we're going to move on and talk about some insect vector diseases. So in the next few lectures, we're going to focus on a couple of insect vector diseases, malaria and West Nile virus. But on this slide, you can see a number of other diseases that you will find that are also vectored by insects. So this includes things like encephalitis, yellow fever, sleeping sickness, bubonic plague, Chagas disease, and many others. All right, so many of the vectors that we've talked about so far have been in the order Diptera. And so this would include the mosquitoes, but also many other types of flies, black flies, tsetse flies, which spread sleeping sickness, deer flies, and sand flies. We also have things like fleas, which cause the plague, and human lice. Now, one interesting hemiptera, the assassin bug, is the responsible vector of Chagas disease. Now, what's interesting about this is that even though they are a blood feeder, they don't pass the pathogen through the act of drawing blood. Instead, what they do is it's through their feces. So they will release feces while they're feeding on you, and if those feces get within that wound once the bug has left, that is how the pathogen enters the human system and will make you sick with Chagas disease. Now, pathogens vary from viruses, bacteria, protists, protozoans, and nematodes.